Hi everyone, Rachael here. Welcome to episode number 50 of the Ditch the Diet podcast. So in today's episode of the podcast, we are revisiting our Inspiring Stories series, and we have the pleasure of the company of Hope Virgo. Hope is a mental health campaigner, and Hope actually has suffered with anorexia for over 4 years before being admitted to a mental health hospital back in 2007, where she lived for a year. And after she was discharged, she has fought to stay well ever since, having a relapse just 2 years ago in 2016. Hope is now at the stage of ongoing recovery, and she wants to use her experience of mental health illness to champion the rights of others, to help them, inspire them to get well and help to break the stigma of mental illness as well. Hope is also running a campaign called Dump the Scales, and it's to help people with eating disorders actually get the access to the services that they require. We'll speak a little bit about a petition that Hope has at the moment in the interview you'll hear in just a second, and I'll be back at the end to let you know how you can go about supporting this petition and Hope in her journey to helping people with eating disorders get more help, more services, and have access to the help that they deserve. So thank you very much for listening to the podcast. As always, make sure you subscribe, and without any further ado and rambling from me, here is the interview with Hope. Hi Hope, thank you so much for joining me today and for giving up your valuable time to come onto the podcast and have a chat.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be on.
It's great to have you. So we're here today to talk about your petition, your Dump the Scales petition. But before we do that, I'd like to just ask you a little bit of background about yourself, and we can kind of get the idea of why the petition came around. First of all, so could you tell me a little bit about yourself, about how the petition came about, and maybe we can sort of move our way backwards and start from the beginning?
You know, that's fine. So the petition came about 8 months ago, 6 months ago probably actually. So in July 2018. And the reason I launched it was because a couple of years ago I relapsed with my eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And I reached out for support, but wasn't able to get support because I wasn't underweight. Mm-hmm. And when that happened, I was just left in this kind of like limbo phase where I'm like, the anorexia is in my head telling me that I'm this fake rubbish anorexic and that I should try and prove myself to everyone and just lose all of that weight if I've really got something the matter. Mm-hmm. And kind of caught between this battle in my head going on constantly to whether actually I just try and recover again on my own. Mm-hmm. And luckily for me, I've got a very tight support network around me. So with kind of a combination of that and going back to the basics of meal planning and exercise and all of that sort of stuff, mm-hmm. I was able to recover. But when I came through my relapse, I started to speak out a lot more about my eating disorder and my recovery. And I met so many people who come up against exactly the same barrier, people who are so desperate for support, mm-hmm. but aren't able to access it because their BMI is not underweight. And it seems like every time you speak to anyone new, they're going into hospitals, and the hospitals have put down the BMI criteria even more. So then this person isn't eligible for help, even if they are underweight or kind of on the borderline. Mm-hmm. And I got so fed up with hearing all these stories that I thought I should try and change it. So my petition is about trying to get the clinical guidelines implemented properly across the whole country, so people aren't judged on their weight, but they're judged on their mental state. But also to get GPs trained up in eating disorders so they have more of an understanding around eating disorders and how you can diagnose people and the kind of things that you should be and shouldn't be saying to someone. Mm-hmm. And then also looking at whether we could introduce some sort of standard to measure diagnosis of eating disorders so that we can actually have an accurate portrayal on the fact that, yes, we know the numbers are going up, but yet no one is able to access that support. Mm-hmm. So trying to take a more kind of proactive, preventative type approach.
Okay. And you recovered from anorexia when you were younger. Could you tell me a little bit about when that started? How did you first recognise that your eating patterns were becoming sort of not normal, so to speak?
Yeah, so I developed anorexia when I was about 13 years old. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I didn't think anything was the matter with me. I had this voice in my head that used to tell me exactly what to do with food and exercise. And every time I did what it told me to do, I'd get this sense of achievement and feel like amazing for doing it. And the more I did it, the better I felt. Mm-hmm. And it helped me to completely switch off from everything that was going on around me and all of these emotions that I didn't like feeling. And it gave me this kind of sense of control over my life, which I didn't feel like I had. Mm-hmm. I hid that for about 4 years, and throughout that whole period, didn't think anything was the matter. And even when I ended up going to the child adolescent mental health service as an outpatient, and then eventually being admitted to a mental health hospital, I didn't think there was anything the matter with me. And I was so adamant that this thing that I was talking to in my head was totally normal, and that I couldn't understand why people were trying to take away this thing that made me feel so good about myself. And so I turned kind of a lot of people against me throughout my diagnosis. Right. But eventually I had to kind of come to this realization when I was in hospital that I did have something the matter with me, and kind of accept that the way that I was living my life, listening to this voice in my head and not really eating and exercising a lot, was just not right. And if I kept on doing it, it was going to be really dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And what age are you now? Sorry, just to get a bit of context on the length of your journey.
Yes, I'm 28.
Okay. And what was the sort of, so there was 4 years where you actually had these symptoms. That's a long, long time.
Yeah, it was. And I think it became so normal to me mm-hmm. to kind of like, no, not like what I shouldn't be eating, to get away with missing family meal times. Mm-hmm. And I think you become so like obsessed with making that voice in your head happy. Mm-hmm. And I think the only time that it really made me unhappy was the 6 months before I got admitted to hospital, mm-hmm. when my family were trying to make me eat, and then I was arguing with them, and I felt like I was at this kind of dead end with it. And I'd keep weighing myself, and my weight would get to a certain weight, but then I wouldn't be happy. So I'd be like, oh, I'll just lose a little bit more and get to this weight, and then everything will be okay. Then I'd get to that weight and it wasn't working for me. So I'd try again and again. And I just got caught in this like downward spiral mm-hmm. where I didn't know what to do about it or how I'd ever get out of it.
Mm. And do you know what triggered it? Was there a particular life event or a situation that you recall? Or was it, was there something at school or in your family? Or can you think of anything that particularly...
Yeah. So I think throughout my whole childhood, I'd always really struggled with emotions. Mm-hmm. And I remember even at the age of 9, my mum would get frustrated when she'd try and have a conversation with me, and I'd be quite emotionally unengaged with everything that was going on around me. Mm-hmm. And so I think probably a combination of the fact that I hated feeling things, mm-hmm. but so I was sexually abused when I was about 12, and I didn't want to talk about it with anyone. I felt really guilty and really ashamed about it. Mm-hmm. And I hated all of that feeling that came with it, and this kind of like out of control that I've been put in this situation where I didn't know what to do about it, and I didn't know how to process it. And the anorexia helped me to just switch off from all of this stuff that was going on, mm-hmm. and helped me to just feel kind of safe and secure in something else.
Mm-hmm. No, I get it. I understand. And when you eventually did ask for help, did you ask for help? When was the first time that you felt like you could reach out to someone and say, I know my behaviour is making me unwell, like I need some help? Where did you go, and how did you make that decision?
So I don't think I really did make that decision. I think at times, I remember one evening I went to the cinema with my sister, and it was just before I went into hospital. And at that day, I'd kind of said to myself that I was going to try really, really hard to eat what was given to me and try and stick with the plan from the hospital and all of this. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in the car next with my sister driving to the cinema, and telling her that I didn't know what to do, and that I felt really stuck in it, and that I really did want to get better. Mm-hmm. But after that kind of like snapshot of saying that to her, I didn't engage with it at all. Like I then didn't want anyone to help. And I think the thing with anorexia is, as soon as you ask for that support, you get this like flood of guilt. And so you then don't feel like you can talk about it. Mm. So even when I was admitted to hospital, I didn't really ask for help, probably not until kind of 6 months into my time there. Mm-hmm. And that was when I had to ask for help, because my weight was going up, but mentally I was really struggling. And I had this realization that I could just keep kind of yo-yoing back and forward in my weight, but it wasn't going to do anything for me. And my life was just on hold, stuck in this hospital with nothing to do. And at that point, when I realized that, I was like, I actually do need someone to like talk to about this and someone to try and help process what's going on for me.
And when you were in hospital, what sort of was their main concern getting you to a certain BMI, or what help did you actually get there? And
so the first couple of months was just focusing on your weight, so trying to get me back up to a more stable weight, and out of kind of like a dangerous zone. And then when I got to that point, I was able to do bits of therapy. So I did a lot of one-to-one therapy, some group therapy, and then some exercise therapy as well, which for me was like a massive part of my illness, but also is a massive part of my recovery and how I stay well now. And so kind of like little bits and pieces of different things. The one thing that did really help me as well, actually, was after every single meal time, we had this group where everyone who had an eating disorder would go into this room and talk about how the meal made them feel. And when I think about it, I think it's really bizarre, but actually it really worked, because it got you to eat the food, and then you could go into a room and basically talk about how awful it made you feel and about how rubbish everything was, but that you still ate the food. So it helped remove all of that kind of negative emotion from the food.
And did you find that was one of the things that worked best for you then on your road? How long was your recovery?
So I was in hospital for a year, and then had like a gradual discharge towards the end. But after that, I didn't really get any support, just because I turned 18 towards the end of my admission in hospital, and I just kind of fell through the transition gap.
Right, okay.
I kind of left hospital, and then my mum was really supportive, so she kind of kept me on track with everything, kind of made sure that I was eating enough and all of that. And I stuck quite rigidly to all of the meal plans in hospital, so I became quite institutionalized for the first couple of years when I left hospital, just because I knew exactly what time I had to eat stuff and how much I had to eat, and I knew that was okay for my weight, and I still felt in control of it.
Yeah. And we're now 2018, so 10 years down the line, is that right?
Yeah.
10 years from that point. What has happened in that time? So how are you now?
So I think I manage my recovery now. So when I left hospital, I went to uni and then got a job and then went traveling. And when I was traveling, I felt like I was in this really good space with it. And I didn't think about the eating disorder. I never had that voice in my head anymore. And I didn't have to calorie count or exercise or anything. Like everything just seemed to kind of click into place. And I was probably in a really good place, probably for like 6-7 years when I came out of hospital, and like just felt like I was completely cured. But then in 2016, I relapsed after my grandma passed away. And after that, and then getting turned away from services, it's been a bit of a kind of like uphill struggle at times. And I now might have to manage my recovery probably on like a week by week basis. I know what I need to do to stay well, but I'm still not at that point where I'm 100% back to being fully relaxed around food, which is frustrating at times. But at the same time, I'm trying to do this thing at the moment where I challenge my recovery every day. So I have I won't always choose like an easy meal off a menu in a restaurant, or if I'm out and about and hungry, I'll have like a snack that I might not normally let myself have. So trying to kind of push that anorexic voice just further and further out of my head, and know that when I do it, it's a good thing and the world's not going to completely end.
Yeah, so almost deliberately pushing yourself out of your comfort zone to sort of strengthen.
Yeah, and it's hard. And like when I do it, I feel really guilty sometimes, and I kind of get this like nagging voice in my head telling me that I shouldn't be doing it. But I think for me, it's just so important, because otherwise my like anorexia bubble around me is just going to keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And like, then there's a chance that actually I'll keep limiting things that I want to do with my life. And like, life is just way too short to be like stressing over the calories in like something that you've had like a week before.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I've never had an eating disorder, but I would say that I've suffered myself from disordered eating, especially like working in the fitness industry for such a long time. For me, it was the pressure to look a certain way, and I've had so many ups and downs with food, and totally different ways, like restricting food and then not restricting food, and then going through periods of time where I felt like I must look a certain way. It was always about how you looked in the industry when I worked in the industry, and it was never really about how you feel. And that's what I'm trying to get across as part of this podcast as well, is to help people recover. I don't even know if recover is the right word, but from a disordered eating pattern as well. So by eating disorder, what is there an actual definition of that, as opposed to someone who's perhaps struggling with a disordered eating pattern? Is there a way to identify it?
Yeah, I think they're quite similar in that sense. I think nowadays there's just so many different types of eating disorders, and they're all fairly negative. And personally, like, whether you're struggling from disordered eating or you've got full-blown anorexia or bulimia or binge eating disorder, I think with that, if you've got an unhealthy relationship with food, it's important to find a way to tackle it. Because I think there's that tendency that if you start restricting in one way, then it can escalate and completely become out of control.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me, like extreme restriction about 5-6 years ago, to the point where I ended up being scared to eat anything for fear of gaining weight or becoming ill, or, you know, all these anxieties, and that all resulted as a result of restricting foods because I wanted to look a certain way. And when I look back when you look back, you'll know yourself, like on reflection, you look back and you look at your behaviours. I don't know if you're the same, but I look at the behaviours that I displayed even just 5 or 6 years ago, and I think, I can remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but I look back and I think, who was that person? Like, I don't even recognise how it even became that bad.
Yeah, it does. That's what I think is so scary about it, is you think that everything's okay and that you're in kind of control of it, and then suddenly something can happen and it just pushes you over the edge and you lose all of that control, and you will do anything you can not eat certain foods or exercise a certain amount, regardless of how else it makes other people feel. Oh yeah. Social situations for me were an absolute nightmare. So, you know, eventually I just gave it up completely for a while, years. Just avoided going out, avoided going to friends' house for lunch, dinners. It was, when I look back, my eating patterns were just terrible. And I always felt like I would like to have got help. I was never underweight. And I used to think, there's no point in me asking for help. People would just look at me and think, oh, you're a fitness instructor, like, you should have your shit together, kind of thing. So I never did. And I suppose in a way I like you now, I sort of managed it myself, and I'm in a much better place now, thankfully. But yeah, there's been lots of challenges in it, and I come across people all the time, like every single day in the work that I do, their eating patterns are disordered and they can't seem to be able to get the right sort of help. So that's why when I saw your campaign about your petition, that's why I was so keen to speak to you about it. What was, just before I'm going to ask you some questions about that, so that the people that are listening can go and have a look and hopefully sign your petition as well. What was the biggest challenge that you faced with not only the petition but in your life at the moment? So I think something, that's happened recently. So I cycled across the UK for charity.
Oh, wow.
Like 6 weeks ago. So did from John O'Groats to Land's End over 2 weeks.
Wow.
Kind of cycling 90 miles a day was like an amazing achievement in itself. But for me, like, managing to have enough food every day was also a really real positive for me. What I didn't kind of realise when I agreed to do it, and even when I was doing it, I thought when I came back it would just be easy to kind of slip back into normal life again and not feel the need to exercise all the time. But since back, I've had to kind of go back to the basics with my exercise and remind myself that I don't need to be exercising that much every single day. I'm not trying to lose weight, like, I'm just trying to be healthy. And And that has been a real challenge to try and stay on top of it, actually, and not kind of get obsessed with exercising again. And kind of managing that. So what I've done is I went and actually saw my personal trainer, who I haven't seen properly since I relapsed, and had like a session with her just to go back to that basic kind of understanding of training and not overtraining and making sure that I'm fueling myself in the right way.
Yeah, I think having that support of someone is vital. Yeah,
and it's funny, isn't it? Because it's the kind of stuff that you know is true, and you know what you're saying is right, and you can probably tell yourself it. But if there's someone who's a professional telling you, you're likely to believe it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I am a professional. I can't even take my own advice most of the time. So there are lots of people slipping through the net when it comes to getting help for eating disorders at the moment, because of the way that they are, I suppose, graded on BMI. So can you tell me a little bit about that? What are the guidelines? Is it a black and white? Okay, you are not underweight. We can't offer you help.
So the guidelines used to say that, but they got updated a couple of years ago, and now the guidelines say that you should not turn someone away from treatment because of their weight, but you should judge them on their mental state.
Right.
That's the issue, is the guidelines are there, but they're just being implemented. And I think I see like a number of reasons this is happening. But with eating disorders, the problem is that people are trying to get support. They then get turned away, which then leaves them feeling like really suicidal, at a complete loss. They don't know what to do with themselves. And they then get more unwell. And then they have to then end up as an inpatient in a hospital. So then their life becomes kind of more institutionalized. They become kind of set in this hospital setting. And then their recovery time is so much longer.
Right.
And I think that's my biggest frustration. It's like, it's a no-brainer. If we made the guidelines implemented properly and people weren't just judged on their weight, but we talked about our mental state and we said we're really struggling, then actually you'd be preventing people ending up in hospital. And you'd also have a quicker recovery time for people. But the longer you leave someone struggling, the harder it is to recover, because all of that stuff that you learn and you kind of all those practices that you get obsessed with doing, they just become so ingrained in every part of your life that you just can't break them.
What seems to be the problem with getting the guidelines to be recognised? Is that a communication problem between I suppose the government setting the guidelines and the people that are on the ground,
I think
GPs
it's like
and doctors?
So I think there is a huge thing around communication and the fact that people don't really know what the guidelines are, perhaps. But I think there's also something around training. So GPs get a very, very little amount of training around eating disorders.
Right.
And they don't probably really understand fully what they are. I think quite often, if like a young girl will go and show themselves to a doctor and say, I'm really struggling with food, the doctor might just think it's a phase that they're going through, so they won't take it seriously. Or if it's a male, they might say that actually men don't get eating disorders or something like that. So there's just a real lack of understanding around it. And so doctors don't know what to do and they don't know how to diagnose someone. I also think there's a huge funding issue, and this is obviously cuts across the whole of the NHS. But with eating disorders, it means that they don't have enough funding to treat people. And so they then wait until they hit that crisis point, because there's just such a massive long waiting list that they can't do anything about it.
Wow.
And actually, I've spoken to some clinicians about my campaign, and they all like fully back it because they know it's something that needs to happen. And they're frustrated by the fact that there isn't funding in place and that there isn't the right guidance in place for people to actually get that support.
That must be so frustrating for so many different people that are on the ground trying to do the right thing. What would you like to see change as a result of the petition? What are the main things that you want to see completely change?
So I'd like there to be a preventative strategy and approach to eating disorders. So trying to get people in early so they can get that support mentally so that their eating disorder doesn't develop any further than like it already has done. And I think as well something around the GP training and that whole kind of general understanding for GPs, so they know the things that you should and shouldn't say to people with eating disorders, and kind of other ways that you can support them. And I think as well, like just as kind of like an extra but not related to GPs or the NHS, but it's just that whole public understanding. Like, we live in a society where people think to have an eating disorder you've got to be stick thin and look like a skeleton, but actually you can have an eating disorder and be any shape and any size, but still mentally really be struggling. So I think it's about actually changing that entire understanding and trying to find a way to tackle it.
Yeah, that sounds, from what I see on a day-to-day basis, I think that is so important. Just before we sort of wrap up and we can tell people where they can find the petition and sign it, because I really hope if you're listening that you will do that. It will literally take less than 30 seconds to do. What would you say to someone who's maybe listening to the episode of the podcast that might feel that they're struggling with disordered eating or an eating disorder or mental health issue, that is perhaps fearful of asking for help? Is there any advice that you could give?
I think the first thing is just try not to be scared of seeking that support. I know how frustrating it is and how it makes you feel when you get turned away from services because you don't fit within the criteria that they're looking for. But actually, as individuals, we have every right to access that service. So I think trying to encourage people to have that kind of courage to go back to services and try again. And if they're really struggling, to go back again and to keep asking for that support. I also think it's that actually, so for me, the anorexia became like having this best friend with me all the time. And I like thrived off it. I loved it. And I thought it made everything okay. But I had to have this realization that actually my life was not in a good place. I wasn't in a good way. I was just kind of functioning every single day and just really unhappy. So I think as individuals, like if you're struggling with food, it's about actually kind of trying to find a way to beat that and thinking about your motivations to get well and realizing that you think that anorexia is your best friend, but the reality is it isn't. And whatever it offers you and gives you, in the long run, you're not going to actually be that happy with it. So it's about actually finding other ways to make yourself happy and kind of live a more fulfilling life in that sense.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Thank you so much. So the petition, where can people find it if you're listening and you would like to support? What's the best way to find out more about it?
So if you go on Google and type in dump the scales and then my name, so Hope Virgo, then the petition should come up quite early on. And it would be amazing. We've got just over 65,000 signatures and got a lot of like work going on in Parliament and things. But even just this morning, actually, I got a letter back from the Department of Health from written kind of on behalf of one of the ministers. And it was kind of like saying that this isn't an issue. We know that this is happening, but everything's in place to tackle it. And it's, well, no, it's not, because if this wasn't an issue, I wouldn't be talking about it all the time. People wouldn't be contacting me, telling me about it. So I think it's important that actually we keep putting that pressure on the government to actually make this change happen. And one way of doing that is to get to that 100,000 signatures so that we can raise it properly. I was just going to ask what the target was. So still got a bit to go yet. 85,000. I know it, but it's, I mean, you're more than halfway there now. So hopefully we can get a few more signatures with the podcast. What stage is it at? So you basically need to wait until you get to the 100,000 for it to be. So we're waiting for the 100,000. But in the meantime, I'm doing some work with kind of like a select group of MPs. So Weira Hobhouse, who's the MP for Bath, has put together an early days motion, which we're trying to get cross-party support for at the moment. We've got 25 MPs supporting it. So if your MP isn't supporting it, do have a look and kind of get in touch with them if they're not and ask them to get behind it. It's the Early Days Motion 1765 on eating disorder treatment and diagnosis. And so the aim with that is once that's got enough cross-party support, then we can get a proper, like another debate going on it in Parliament, and hopefully that will kind of help that change happen as well. That's great. I'm going to make sure that we get all the links to everything that you've mentioned in the show notes. So if you're listening to the podcast, all you need to do if you're on iTunes or Spotify is just scroll down on your screen. You'll see all the links. You just click or just tap your screen and it will take you directly to the correct place for you to sign the petition and find out more about it.
thank you so much, Hope, for your time today. I really appreciate it a lot, and wishing you all the best. I don't like saying good luck because I don't believe in luck, but I'm wishing you every success with this, and I can't wait to hear when you hit that 100,000 signatures.
Cool, fab. Thank you very much.
So I would just like to say a very big thank you again to Hope for joining me for this episode of our Inspiring Stories series on the Ditch the Diet podcast. I really appreciate it a lot. If you would like to find out more about what Hope does and the Dump the Scales campaign alongside the petition, we'd really appreciate it if you could just take just 60 seconds out of your day just to search for the petition or click on the link in the show notes and place your signature on there. It really would mean a lot. So that's it for another episode of the podcast. I'll be back next Thursday as always with another episode. Until then, you can contact me at any time. Just email Rach, RACH, at ditchthedietacademy.com. I'll see you next time.